Well, hi there. It's Captain Buck Rogers, jet fighter pilot, ace of the base here, and I'm going to tell you about fighter pilot tales from the dark side. Now, you know I'm a fighter pilot because I got my fighter pilot glasses, dark glasses, even though it's indoors. I've got my fighter pilot scarf here. I have my fighter pilot checklist here, and I just need to tell you. Oh, I love the smell of Gowade in the morning. You just can't beat that. Okay, well, no, I know. You're probably going, wait a minute. This is Ron Rogers' channel. Yeah, I know. I can't fool you. We'll take that off. It's hard to see indoors with the sunglasses. Of course, it's hard to see without glasses at all. I'm not the young pilot I used to be. But let's talk about the F-107. This is a continuing saga of the missing Century Series fighters. And I'll tell you about the Century Series fighters I flew when I get to the end of this presentation. But I got a couple of things here. Those of you who have flown the Tweety Bird, the T-37, or even the Super Tweet, the A-37, have something in common with this aircraft, the F-107. Pretty interesting. And at the end, I've got a little confession to make here, but I'll tell you about that at the end. Now, it's kind of interesting how little things can drive the design of an aircraft. It's very common in small fighter type aircraft that there's a certain requirement that drives the entire aircraft. And one of the things about the F-107 was that the Air Force wanted a nuclear capable fighter bomber. Actually, they wanted a derivative of the F-100. Actually, initially they called this the F-100B, and you'll see, and I'll point out a lot of the resemblance to the Super Sabre. And one thing they wanted this aircraft to be able to do was to carry a 1,680-pound Mark 7 tactical nuclear gravity bomb. Okay, and that bomb, they wanted it to be carried conformally, which means it's carried, underneath the aircraft, but not in a bomb bay as such. Initially, the Air Force said, hey, we want you to build 33 of these aircraft, at the time called the F-100B, and but early on in the program, about June 11, 1954. Okay, this is a long time ago. These 100 series aircraft, quite a while ago, they changed the designation to the F-107A. Now, you probably go on 107A. Well, what happened to 107? Well, obviously, the 107A is the Canadian version. No, just kidding there. The design had evolved so much that they dropped even the 107, and it's okay. It's up to the A. And it was an interesting design. It carried a lot of the Super Sabre aspects over, but it was a longer fuselage. It was an all-moving vertical fin, which is kind of interesting. They were, this is early on in understanding high-speed aerodynamics. And they know that the shock waves can blank out the rudder, so you have to have a very big. Well, you need a big rudder for the CN beta, the lateral damping force, to keep the thing from going sideways. But you also need deep flight controls to be ahead of the shock wave, because part of the flight control after the shock wave doesn't do you any good. And that's why you can't use the typical thin, long-span ailerons like on my Great Lakes. That'd be very bad supersonic, but there's a lot of reasons my Great Lakes wouldn't do so well supersonic anyway, and that's the ailerons is not the issue there, but I digress. Okay, it's on the shirt here, but I digress. Okay, but anyway, where was I? Oh, that's why they went to spoilers in one of the first aircraft designed with spoilers. Okay. Now, it had an automatic flight control system. Now, back then, the avionics wasn't very sophisticated. I mean, they're using little pixie tubes and stuff like that. So, and I'll talk about these design considerations in just a second. And they used a variable inlet design above the head there, right behind the pilot. And it's kind of interesting. They talk about it in some of the literature I read as controlling the airflow into the J75. Actually, it was a YJ75 at the time, P-9 turbojet engine, 24,504 pounds of thrust. Now, it's not so much adjusting the amount of airflow. It's adjusting, if you will, the type of airflow, because a normal turbojet engine cannot take supersonic air. And if this is a supersonic aircraft, supersonic air is going to be coming in. So what you have to do is you have to slow the air down. So initially you do two types of shocks, and normally well, that's one of the shocks, but first you have the oblique shock, which takes the air from higher supersonic speed to lower supersonic speed, and you design the inlet this way to produce that shock. And then you have a second shock called normal shock, because it's vertical, and that takes the airflow from supersonic to subsonic, so the engine can take it without getting all upset and flaming out. All right, so here's what an F-107A looks like with all the skin taken off. You can kind of see the innards here a little bit. And what drove the design was this conformal bomb carrying. And it was supposed to be a conformal nuclear bomb, and they figured, well, the bombs are going to get smaller as time goes on, which they did. They got better at miniaturizing things. And you could either carry a nuke there, or you could carry a fuel tank. But basically, because it had to be conformal, it got in the way of the jet engine, so you had to move the jet engine up. Well, when you move the jet engine up, what are you going to do with the intake? That gets to be a problem. You know, the F-105, which was the aircraft that competed against the 107A, and I'll tell you about that in a second, because that's very interesting digression here. But, you know, it went out the side. They decided to have this at the top. It made the design of the canopy interesting, and I'll show you that. So there's the canopy, and the canopy had to raise straight up. So getting into that thing was a little bit of a challenge there. You had to maneuver around that canopy, and it was kind of an interesting ejection sequence, possibly. The canopy was supposed to jettison, but it was one of the first aircraft that, okay, that's fine. You can actually punch right through the canopy if you need to. But this is what the 107A looked like, all ready to go. And as opposed to the 103 that I talked about, this aircraft, they actually built 3 of the aircraft. And you can see next to the yellow ladder there, those are some of the gun ports. This aircraft had 3 M39E 20 millimeter cannons installed, 2 on each side. It also had 6 underwing ordnance points in addition to the center fuselage, which could carry the bomb there. But there's an interesting distinction here that was one of the reasons, supposedly, for the downfall of the 107 against the 105, was the fact that it did not have an internal bomb bay capacity, and the 105 could carry more ordnance. But the 107 was actually a very interesting airplane from the aspect of, you know, it carried on the Super Sabre design, but it was quite a bit bigger than the Super Sabre, if you will. Now for you tweet pilots who are weighted with bated breath, wondering why there is a similarity between this and the tweet. Well, you see that yellow arrow right there? There it is. Now, I looked up in the literature. I thought that was like a PL-259 or something. It had a number, that little course deviation indicator there. Every tweet pilot knows about that. And you got the little heading indicator down there, and you talked about it being a toilet seat, and you set on that, and all sorts of weird things to know how to do it. And RMI there too, top cat, all that stuff you learned on how to do intercepts and stuff like that. And you see, this is a picture of the cockpit. Obviously, it's unfortunate. This is the one in Wright-Patterson, and somebody pilfered a couple of the instruments there. Too bad they couldn't fill those holes back in. But you can see this is such an amazing aircraft that even sitting there, still it's climbing at 150 feet per minute. That is pretty impressive. Now, one thing I want to talk about is the Society of Experimental Test Pilots was formed September 14th, 1955, a year before this aircraft flew, and I'll tell you about some of the first flight information here in just a second. But they put out this really interesting book on the history. I mean, it is leather-bound. It is beautiful. It starts out with a dedication here by, Jimmy Doolittle. I mean, it is an amazing detailed book. And the society in the first 20 years, which this is the first 20-year history, they had a lot of imagination, a lot of high goals, but the materials, the components, the propulsion, and the flight control systems weren't up to a lot of the imagination people had. I mean, this was a great time in aviation. They had great concepts. You read the book there, and it basically says, man, by the 70s, everybody's going to be going everywhere at Mach 3 airliners, stuff like this. And they had some very grandiose attitudes, projections, thoughts about how great things were going to be, and of course reality was a little more of a harsher critic there. Now, what's kind of interesting, I was asked by the executive director at the time of SCTP if I would consider editing the book of the next 20 years. Okay, well, it's kind of interesting because I said that would be a gargantuan task. Aviation has so exploded that from that point on, talking about the history of society would just be almost an insurmountable task. So I bowed off on that one. That would have been a horrendous job. So the history of the society, you can get this nice book. It's only the first 20 years, unfortunately, after that, because aviation just exploded. Now, this is one of the F-107As being produced in the North American factory. Now, one thing, if you're looking at this, you may notice, well, that intake, that's not very conducive to looking to the rear. Well, this was an era where they thought, we don't need guns anymore, although fortunately they were thinking forward enough to put 4 20-millimeter guns on. That's nice, but they thought air combat is going to all be involved with missiles. And of course, they found out early in Vietnam that was a big mistake, because you're out there and you fire missiles at each other and you defeat each other's missiles, and now you've closed a gun range. Well, if you're 3,000 feet or less, you're into gun range, and you don't have anything to shoot at, you're kind of at a disadvantage. And some early F-4 pilots found out very quickly, as they made head-on passes at high speed against MiGs, where the MiG had the nose on fire because it was shooting its cannon at them, that it would have been very nice to have had a gun to fire back. Although, you can talk a lot about high-speed gun passes. That gets pretty gutsy, but I'm digressing there. But the interesting thing about the F-107A was it was North America's last fighter. These are the guys who produced the P-51 used in World War II, the F-86 used in the Korean War, and the F-100 used in the Vietnam War. And North American never produced a fighter after this time. But I'll get into some of the aspects of why the 105 was chosen over the 107A. A lot of people considered the 107A the best fighter aircraft that was never produced. And here again is a picture of the cockpit. This is setting in the Wright-Patterson Air Force Museum. And it's interesting in this picture, you can look at the Goblin over there setting in the museum, and behind it is the X-3, an experimental aircraft. So quite interesting little view there. Now here's some views of the 107 Ultra Sabre. Of course, they called the F-100 the Super Sabre, and so they called this the Ultra. One time Super Sabre, and then Ultra Sabre. But some of the literature says that at the time nobody really called it that. That was kind of a designation that was put on. But you can see there's quite a resemblance between this aircraft, the plan form, and the F-100. Of course, here's a picture of the F-100 here, and another picture of the F-107, and that's, of course, you can see the conformal tank there. And this is another picture of it in flight. Now, the first flight of the 107A took place with Chief Pilot Bob Baker at the controls on September 10th of 1956. And it's kind of interesting. They were fairly gutsy. A lot of times first flights, they tend to be kind of cautious in that. But they went up to Mach 103. Now, Bob Gilliland, who was the chief test pilot on the SR-71, they got into one of these time constraint things where they had to make a requirement to fly the SR-71 before the end of the year. And they were also required to demonstrate it could go supersonic before the end of the year. So basically, he took off, maintained 400 knots indicated airspeed, and climbed. And 400 knots indicated will, if you climb high enough, which he did, will take you supersonic. And so he took off, did the first flight, went supersonic, came back and landed. So they acquired all the various requirements on that flight. The test group was joined by a second F-107A, which made its first maiden flight on 28 November of 56, and it was used for weapons testing. And the last prototype made its maiden flight on 10 December of 1956. Now, as what often tended to happen in the early development of these aircraft were cutting-edge aircraft. And back in the 50s through the 70s, if the program didn't pan out for one reason or another, NASA was able to pick up the aircraft. This is F-107A number 3. That went to NASA. Unfortunately, in September of 59, Scott Crossfield was making a takeoff in this aircraft, and there was a problem, and he ended up essentially crashing on takeoff. He wasn't injured, of course. And Scott Crossfield, absolutely amazing individual, just an absolute gentleman. Of course, he was the one in the X-15 where they were doing a ground engine run and the airplane exploded. And he said he did the fastest speed for the shortest distance. And he was telling me about being inside the X-15 and the fire. I mean, there's a big fireball all around, and the firemen are coming up, and he's telling him basically to go away, because inside the aircraft, in the spacesuit he was in, he was essentially fairly safe, and the flames were on the outside, and it was going to be okay. And it was kind of like, just work on the fire, get to me in just a minute. I'm okay in here, but it's more dangerous on the outside. So anyway, excellent gentleman who had just a remarkable career. But that's what happened to the number 3 prototype. Now here's another view of the ill-fated 107A tail number 120 that was used by Scott Crossfield. And the aircraft, as I said, was damaged. It was not repaired. It was used for firefighting training, which is kind of the sad aspects. They didn't really think about how historically interesting these aircraft were at the time, and they put them out on the photo resolution range where aircraft decayed. I did an earlier thing about that, about a museum out there in the middle of the desert, kind of unplanned. Now, tail number 118, which was the very first prototype, this one actually ended up going to the Pima Air and Space Museum, which you can view if you're out there in that, and it's absolutely a great museum if you haven't seen it. And here's another picture of the aircraft out there. They beautifully restored it, paint and everything like that. All right, here's a picture of the prototype number 2, tail number 119, which was flown under its own power to the National Air Force Museum at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and of course is there in a very nice display. It was owned by what was known as NACA, which was the predecessor of NASA. Once the space program got going, and which was led by the Russians, they changed their name, NACA to NASA. And here's another picture in the museum, very nice display. Now, the F-107A could climb faster than the F-105. They both had the same J75 engine, of course, but the 107A could climb faster and climb higher. But this was a period where we were moving away from thinking the threat was going to be high-altitude supersonic to more of a low high-speed penetration. And one thing, supposedly the reason, the official reason that the Air Force liked this was that the F-105 had a fully integral bomb bay that could carry 40% more ordnance, 14,000 pounds of munition, which was 4,000 pounds more than the F-107's payload. So it could carry more bombs. That was the supposed reason. Like I said, the ceiling and the climb rate weren't as important because it was thought it was going to be a low-level strike aircraft. But the real reason it was chosen. And I saw this happen. I was out at test ops in the late 70s, and they had the fly off between what became as the KC-10 and the 747, both to be refueling aircraft. And the test pilot, the chief test pilot on the program, chose the 747 for the follow-on tanker. Absolutely no question. Had much more superior capabilities. Could carry more, and was just going to be a better aircraft. And they announced that they chose the DC-10 to be the KC-10. He was just astounded because, based on all the pilot's input, that was not the aircraft to choose. Well, the problem was McDonnell Douglas was in trouble. Of course, they later were absorbed into Boeing, like a lot of these mergers happen. But McDonnell Douglas was in trouble, and the government kind of wanted to keep him going. And that was basically the same reason that the 105 was chosen, because Republic was building the 105, and they were basically winding up production on the F-84 series of fighters, and they had nothing in the future. And yeah, okay, I understand. You can't let a manufacturer like this go down the tubes if they have any business. Now, they weren't worried about North American at the time because, everything was looking great for them. They were working on the A-5 Vigilante carrier-based nuclear bomber for the Navy, the XB-70 Valkyrie Mach 3 strategic bombers for the Strategic Air Defense Command, and also the XF-108 Rapier Mach 3 interceptor for the Air Defense Command. So all those projects were going. Of course, you know what happened. The XB-70 was canceled. The F-108 was canceled, and I'll talk about that in another episode here. But basically, they were left with just the A-5, which fortunately they did have a program, but things were not as rosy for North American as everybody thought they were. Now, let me talk about my experience with the 107A. Okay, this is a slight digression here. I got into the local Corvette car club, and that's my C7 there, and my wife chose the color. I got to choose everything else, like a C9 with the Z06 with the 650 horsepower convertible and stuff like that. My wife chose the paint job also on the Great Lakes. She's very good at that sort of thing. But basically, I wanted to find out about Corvettes, so I went to the Corvette car club. Well, there's a requirement to be in the club that you actually have to own a Corvette. So when it came around to new people, they said, "Hey, stand up, tell us about yourself, your Corvette." So I said, "Well, I did have a 65 Stingray. It was silver. I painted it myself." They go, "What?" And yeah, I could hold it in my hand. And then they kind of knew that, well, my Corvette really wasn't quite as nice as theirs because they couldn't hold theirs in their hand. Now, my 107 experience is similar. Oh, as a kid, I built all these models. Now, I can't tell you for sure whether it was these people, the Aurora people who did it, or this manufacturer, but I built it. And the one thing interesting about building plastic aircraft, okay, look at that. Doesn't really look like it can go Mach 2, does it? And, back in the days, I had the issue of plastic parts sticking to my hand and being able to pull up the whole aircraft because it was stuck to me. Now, this was, I never took advantage of this. I wasn't adventurous, but this was before they put the mustard smell in plastic cement, and I guess you could actually get high on it. I actually know some kids who did that. I wasn't into that. I was much more sedate, but this is as far as my 107 actual experience got. Now, the thing is, I did get to fly two Century Series aircraft. The F-104 is one of them, and if you extend belief, I guess you'd put it that way. Here's the F-110 that was, of course, later designated the F-4, but it was the last of the F-100s, the Century series, unless you start counting the F-111, which a lot of people said they were glad I included that in there also, because that is still in the Century series aircraft. Of course, the 117 comes in there before we started to go back to the F-15, F-35, F-22, things like that. So this is the end of the tale of the F-107A. 3 were built, 1 unfortunately crashed in a test flight incident, and 2 are in museums, 1 at the Puma Air Museum, 1 at the Wright-Patterson Air Force Museum. So if you get a chance to see these, take a look. And I will be talking next about the XF-108 Rapier, one of the pretty much last of the series of the Century series fighters, the missing series fighters. Thanks for watching.